Hey guys, it's Madison and welcome to this video where I'm going to be breaking down just how well my 2024 went for language learning. So spoiler alert, I actually came into making this video with a very kind of negative impression of how the year went until I started actually looking at the spreadsheets I made, and I was actually quite surprised by what I saw. So little teaser for what's coming up later in this video, but first of all, I want to kind of go over briefly some highs and lows from the past year. Starting off with some highlights. First of all, I had a friend come to visit for almost 3 weeks in Korea. We had a great time traveling around Korea, seeing old friends, even going to Japan. It was my first time in Japan, so super fun time for, again, almost 3 whole weeks. One of the highlights of the year for sure. Second of all, I attended my first academic conference this year, and I also presented at my first academic conference this year, which was kind of terrifying, but also very good for me professionally, and so another kind of highlight of the year, even though it was kind of terrifying at the time. The third one I mentioned a few times before, and that is that I started swing dancing this past year for the first time in around 8 years, and I got super excited about it, super involved, super passionate about swing dancing again, and I'm just super excited to continue that into the future. So definitely a highlight of the year for sure. And then finally, I had kind of a huge reading breakthrough as well, where I read a Korean novel all in one day, which was super exciting and just kind of showed me that my Korean reading is not as terrible as I had thought it was, that I am capable of getting sucked into Korean books just like I do in English. So very exciting overall. Those were the kind of 4 key highlights of the year for me. As for the lows of the year, I'm going to kind of just say that generally the last 6 months of the year was overall a low. I felt very uninspired to make these videos. I felt kind of low motivation just generally for language learning overall. And that is due to kind of 2 more specific reasons. Number one, I had a terrible sleep schedule the second half of the year, especially, which of course was just very energy draining and exhausting in general for my life. And then second of all, I was really struggling to find a way to balance multiple hobbies at the same time. So I got really excited about swing dancing, really passionate about swing dancing, and that made me kind of struggle to find any motivation or energy for my other hobbies of language learning, making these videos, etc. So yeah, those are the kind of language learning lows for the year. Moving on to a more kind of specific breakdown of how things went month by month for the second half of the year. If you're curious about the first 6 months of 2024, I made Q1 and Q2 breakdowns last year that you can check out to see kind of the specific hours and details for those months. But I'm going to go ahead and kind of do a quick quarterly review of Q3 and Q4, and then move on to reviewing the year as a whole. So Q3 was kind of a weird quarter for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you first the overall time I spent being exposed to languages, both active and passive time. And then I'm going to contrast that with just the active time for Q3. So as you can see, huge difference there. And what that means is that I was binge watching a lot of dramas during these 3 months. So to kind of zoom in and give a few quick kind of key points for each month of Q3, in July, I was in the throes of my summer semester, which is a shortened, more intensive semester. So as a professor, that makes it really a lot more kind of work heavy. So I was generally exhausted. I think my sleep schedule was starting to kind of fall apart here. And so what that meant for me is that when I got home from work, I just wanted to throw on some TV to watch instead of doing anything active. And so I had really high numbers, but I was really low energy and low effort this month. The shows that I binge watched ended up being primarily in Korean, although some Mandarin, of course, as well. Zero Japanese at all this month. And if you look at the little active stuff that I did, it's actually all Hello Talk, which is abnormal for me. I actually was trying to work on a project where I made a video talking about my experience using HelloTalk throughout the years and why I generally don't like it, and it becomes very overwhelming very quickly for me. But then it got overwhelming very quickly and I ended up dropping the project altogether and never making a video on it, ironically. So yeah, that is literally all of the active stuff I did during the entire month of July, just some HelloTalk stuff. It was also mostly small talk, so not necessarily super helpful active Korean texting stuff. I did learn a few words and phrases here and there as I was trying to explain certain things or as people were explaining certain things to me, but yeah, not the most fruitful time spent in Korean for sure. And yeah, if you compare the numbers of overall language exposure of almost 144 hours to just less than 6 hours for active time, it was definitely a very, very, very low energy month for language learning for sure. This was also kind of entering my not very inspired phase for making videos and for kind of language projects overall. I had kind of a period of a few months where I was just not feeling inspired to do anything in languages really. And so this is kind of the beginning of that period, which is again reflected in the lack of active stuff throughout this month. Looking at August, honestly, it starts out mostly the same. At the end of July and the first few weeks of August, this was my summer vacation, so I wasn't as exhausted from work necessarily, but I still was in this low motivation, low energy kind of state of not feeling very motivated to actively do stuff in my languages. So I was still mostly just binge watching a lot of stuff. So I still had high numbers overall. And again, mostly in Korean for the month. But if you look at the active time, much, much less consistent throughout the month. But this is actually the month where I started swing dancing this year. So I signed up for an August class that was every weekend on Saturdays once a week, which accounts for a lot of the little individual spikes on the active graph that you will see because I was interacting a lot in Korean, speaking and listening in Korean during those swing dancing days. And then also in like the fourth-ish week of the month, that was when I was getting ramped up for the fall semester. And so I was doing a kind of reset vlog there, trying to get my motivation back for doing language projects, but also trying to decrease my binge watching of shows to kind of get back in work mode for the semester. And if you look at the overall time as well, you can see I was mostly successful in kind of getting out of that kind of binge watching cycle near the end of the month. So not too bad there. Then moving on to September, the final month of this quarter, it is kind of decreased a bit from the intensiveness of the binge watching of the previous months. I still had a few days here or there where I was focused on mostly just watching dramas, but overall much less so than the previous months. And if you look at the active time, actually, this is where I had my reading week where I did read that book all in one fell swoop, all in one day over the Chuseok holidays. And so I basically had one really strong week there in the middle of the month, but other than that, not a lot of consistency, just those kind of weekly swing dancing experiences for the most part outside of that one reading heavy week. So yeah, once again, looking at the quarter as a whole, you can see not a ton of Japanese, only a few days, the entire quarter spent on any Japanese at all. And looking at the active time for the quarter, basically kind of only 3 weeks of motivation, really. I had a week of Hello Talk, which ended up kind of fizzling out. I had a week of trying to reset for the semester, the fall semester, and then I finally had a week of intensive reading. That was very successful, but again, kind of short-lived. Didn't really help me build up any consistency into the future. All right, moving on to quarter four, the last 3 months of the year, and I'm going to contrast the overall language exposure for quarter three with the overall language exposure for quarter four. And as you can tell, it definitely drops off quite a bit for quarter four, not quite as intense. However, I still was kind of struggling to find overall motivation and energy to put towards language learning in this time. So even though kind of the language exposure was dropping off because I wasn't really watching as many dramas, I wasn't overall very successful in turning that extra time into active language study or reading or that kind of stuff time. So yeah, getting into the month by month look, October wasn't my strongest month in terms of numbers. In fact, the overall time drops off quite steeply. Most of this time is still shows, but at this point I wasn't like binge watching full shows that were already out. I was mostly just watching shows that were coming out kind of on a daily or semi-weekly basis, which resulted in primarily much lower numbers overall. Once again, absolutely no Japanese this month. And if you look at my overall active time this month, you can see very, very little. In fact, 3 of these spikes, the big spikes, are from swing dancing. And the other 2 on October 11th and 12th, I had to go to Gwangju. And so I basically was talking to taxi drivers and that's that time there. So yeah, not really any active study sessions from my own effort. Like all of these things were me being in a place where I had to interact in Korean, not me like choosing to read a book or me choosing to study Korean news or do Chinese or Saturday Reader or any of those things. So not really anything intentional, just me being in places that had Korean happening. So it's good that I had those experiences for sure and it was beneficial for me, but I'm not really happy looking at this graph, knowing that I had literally no motivation this entire month to intentionally attempt to improve my language skills. So again, not my strongest month, and that shows in the graphs and in the overall numbers for sure. Comparing that very empty month to November, a much more successful month. And that is because I was once again finding some motivation to have language learning goals or a project of some sort. So I set the theme of having a news November this month where I was trying to do news stuff every single day. I started out with a much more ambitious goal than what ended up actually occurring, where I wanted to be like every day studying a little bit actively of like news programs and breaking down vocab and that more kind of active approach, what ended up happening is a lot more passive news intake, which I'm still very happy with, because even just kind of watching a news program and looking at the kind of overlay of like headlines that comes across the bottom, I'm still learning a lot that way, but it's not nearly as active as the kind of intensive looking at vocab that I was imagining for the month. I did that a few days of the month, as you'll see in a minute, but again, what ended up happening is much more daily news intake versus daily news study. So again, definitely an improvement compared to the previous month where I had almost no gumption to do any kind of intentional language projects, but not exactly what I had imagined in my overambitious mind. So yeah, in addition to that, I also did a week of Mandarin there in the middle of the month, and also kind of a weekend of all 3 languages near the end of the month. So definitely kind of a lot of projects happening this month, getting my motivation back to make videos, to work on languages overall. So I think this is where I was really starting to kind of find that motivation, that inspiration again to do more languagey stuff in general. Looking at the active time, you can see the days where I was successful kind of breaking down news stuff and doing more active study. Some of the blue spikes were also from swing dancing as well. This month, my lessons were actually taught by an English speaking instructor, so it was a little bit less of the higher spikes of Korean weekly swing dance related stuff, but still it was some weekly speaking and listening in Korean happening because of swing. But again, you can see in the middle there the week of Chinese focus as well as the weekend of trying to do all 3 languages. So that is November. Definitely a huge improvement from the very empty month of October for sure. And then last but not least, moving on to December. So looking at the overall language exposure for the month, you can see it's actually a bit empty, I guess you could say, and that's because of a couple of reasons. The first week there was basically finals week for me, so I was very much focused on school stuff for the most part. And then after my semester ended December 5th, you can see I jumped straight into watching a few dramas, which is totally fine. I don't mind kind of celebrating the end of the semester with a few days of just relaxing and watching some content. The week after that, very Korean focused, and that is when I did another kind of reading focused week where I was trying to read a couple of novels, and I succeeded in doing that. And then December 14th, I actually traveled home to the States where I am currently visiting my family, and so there was a period where I was just focusing on hanging out with them, doing things with them, and so not any language exposure at all for a little while. And then near Christmas there at the end, I did watch a few dramas again just to kind of relax and enjoy the end of the year. This kind of empty end of the year is very typical for me, and I don't really care. I expect this because when I come home, I'm not really worried about languages so much. So that is this month. And yeah, looking at the active time, you can see it's primarily just that reading focus week there in the middle and not really much else beyond that. So yeah, once again, looking at the overall quarter as a whole, it definitely was not as kind of wild as quarter 3 was for me, where it's this huge disparity between my overall time and my active time. And looking at the active time in both quarter 3 and in quarter 4, I think it's just really clear the struggle I was facing trying to get motivation for language learning. Yeah, even though I did kind of find the gumption to work on language projects like roughly once a month, except for in October, it definitely wasn't as consistent as I would ideally like my language study to be. So hopefully moving into 2025, I can be a lot more consistent for sure. Moving on to the overall year breakdown. This is where things start getting really fun and really wild, looking at the total number of hours I spent on things throughout the year. First, I'm going to go ahead and break things down kind of by quarter. I'm going to show the overall exposure time to each language as well as the active time for each quarter this year. And looking at those overall numbers, I'd have to say that I think quarter 2 was the strongest. Technically, quarter 1 had the highest kind of percentage of active time out of overall exposure time, but quarter 2 had a lot higher numbers of active time. And I think I was feeling more excited overall about the language projects that I was working on at that point. So I'm going to call quarter 2 my kind of strongest of the year. And I'm going to say that quarter 3 was the weakest, I think, because again, July and August was just very binge heavy and just no motivation, no inspiration. I did get into swing, but I struggled to feel like doing anything in my languages and making videos. I don't know, I was just kind of burnt out language-wise in this time, even though I had really high numbers because I was just throwing on shows in the background of my day because I had no energy to do literally anything else. So yeah, I'd say that quarter 4 comes in a close second weakest, but I think at the end there, I did kind of build up a bit more motivation and inspiration again. And so it wasn't quite as bad as quarter 3 was. So yeah, that's the quarterly breakdown. And moving on to the final most exciting numbers, I'm gonna go ahead and show the entire year in one graph, which is always a bit wild to look at, honestly. And when I saw this graph, I was actually kind of shocked because in my head, like nothing happened in July and August. I think just because I tend to forget when I watch a lot of dramas, whereas the more active challenges or projects kind of stick in my head more. So it felt like July and August was like a huge blur of nothingness, but I actually, of course, was consuming a ton of content in this time, so it's actually quite dense in this graph. So I was actually quite shocked to see just how full this graph was and how high the numbers ended up being, which was 913 hours and 37 minutes for the entirety of the year, which is almost as high as last year, which was wild to me. Last year, I came into this kind of year-end project feeling so optimistic and positive about my language learning for the year, and then this year to feel so negative about it, and so like I did nothing for half the year, and yet the numbers are almost the same. That was just mind-blowing. But again, I think because the middle months were kind of a blur of nothingness, but I was actually consuming just a ton of content in a really exhausted, energyless state. That really inflated the numbers up to be very close to last year's for the overall time. The active time is a much different story. So looking at that now, you can see that consistency was not my strong suit this year. I definitely have clusters of language learning throughout the year. And you can see in the second half of the year, swing definitely helped me get a lot more Korean exposure and like conversation and listening, active speaking than I would have otherwise gotten, because I was really passionate and excited about swing, but not about doing anything languagey. And so I have a lot more of those little individual spikes throughout the second half of the year that really got more language exposure to me than I would have otherwise gotten if I had just been left to my own motivation and devices otherwise. So definitely grateful for it, but yeah, definitely kind of a year focused more on doing things in little clusters here and there when I found motivation versus consistency throughout the entirety of the year. And the total number of active time is actually just 193 hours and 29 minutes. I say just because it's only 21% of my overall time, which is not as high as I would prefer it to be. But again, that is a lot of time spent on languages this year, a lot more than I expected, honestly, and so I am still pretty proud of what I managed to accomplish this year, even though it wasn't as much as I had dreamed and hoped it would be. It is still more than I thought, and so I am happy with what I did manage to accomplish. And looking at the language breakdown here, obviously Korean is a much stronger first place for sure, and I think swing dancing also really helped boost those numbers up, especially in the second half of the year. And as I was preparing for this video breakdown, I was trying to figure out why I felt so much more negative this year compared to last year coming into this video, and why the numbers are so close to being equal for the overall time, despite my feelings at the end of the year being so remarkably different. Whereas last year I was so excited, so proud, so happy, and this year I was so down. And I think there's two key reasons for that. Number one is overall consistency, which, as you can see, it was much less this year. Part of the reason I was so proud and excited about last year is because of my consistency throughout the year in both language exposure time and also my active language learning days. And if you look at those numbers, I only had 85 days for the entire year where I didn't do any active study, which is just 23% of the days of the year, which means I spent over 75% of the days of the year actively doing something for language learning, which is super, super consistent for me, compared to this year where I had 215 days where I didn't actively study, which is almost 59% of the year. So over half the days of the year I was not actively doing anything in any of my languages. So yeah, much weaker in consistency compared to the previous year. And even just in like passive language exposure, in 2023, I only had 44 days where I didn't have languages like touching my life in some way, either through just shows or active stuff or anything, which is just 12% of the days of the year. That means almost 90% of the days I was having these languages touch my life in some way, through shows or study or whatever. Whereas this past year, 2024, that number more than doubled to 105 days out of the year where I didn't have languages even slightly touch my life, which is almost 29% of the days. So just in every way, I was a little bit less consistent this year, or a lot less consistent for active stuff. So I think that is one of the key reasons why I felt so much more negative about this year compared to the previous year. And the other reason is recency. So in 2023, I had a really, really strong end of the year. I was taking a Korean class. I did a speech contest in Korean, and in November I took the topic and had like a really intensive active study period for like almost an entire month. And so I had a really strong end to the year. And so the recency effect, I was really recalling that recent really strong active month, whereas this year my stronger months were at the beginning of the year, which feels very far away, and my kind of weaker, low motivation, uninspired time was at the end of the year for the most part. And so coming into the end of the year, I had a much more negative feeling overall. So I think the consistency and also the recency both kind of played into this very different feeling at the end of the year, even though the overall numbers were again so similar. So a few final thoughts on this year as a whole before I dive into whether or not I achieved my goals this year, and that is number one, I did find success in these short-term bursts of motivation and challenges, which accounts for all those clusters of active studying throughout the year. But I really struggled with consistency, like I just mentioned, because of a terrible sleep schedule, because of busy semesters, and then also because of new hobbies coming in and disrupting my life. And speaking of new hobbies, swing dancing was a highlight for me because it did open new doors for speaking in Korean and also for community and just social aspects of my life. But number one, it added to the sleep schedule issues because I was getting back really late from Seoul on the weekends now, and also it just took a lot of mental and physical energy from my week, specifically my weekends, which is usually when I refreshed my brain. I was getting more exhausted on the weekends with this super fun activity, but again, that was eating away at my time and energy and motivation. And so a lot of the time that I was devoting to languages and videos was now being put towards swing dancing, and so I really struggled to balance that hobby with my pre-existing one of language learning. So yeah, that kind of sums up my year as a whole. Now switching to my goals. Did I accomplish the goals that I set out for myself at the beginning of 2024? And kind of caveat before I get into all this, I did leave my language learning planner in Korea actually, so I don't have all the specifics of how much time I spent on like news versus speaking versus writing, all those things. And so I'm probably going to make another video once I get back to Korea, kind of breaking down my time spent on certain activities last year and revisit perhaps some of these goals. But for now, I just want to kind of give an overall feeling of how I did last year and whether or not I felt like I achieved these things, even though I don't have the data to back some of them up. So that is what we're going to do. So first of all, my vision for 2024, kind of my overall theme for the year, was to focus on language projects or challenges. And I think I was very successful on this because once again, if you look at the active time I spent on things this year, it's very clearly kind of broken into little projects I was working on any given week or month or weekend or that kind of thing. So I think I was pretty successful on this. My kind of hope was that I wouldn't have any long period of time without any goal or kind of project to work on. I think I was mostly successful. Again, there were periods in like July, August where I did feel like I kind of went for like 6 weeks without any kind of big motivation or goal to work towards. But again, looking big picture, I think I was successful on this kind of overall vision or theme of the year. Moving on to my specific languages, starting with Korean and more specifically Korean reading. My first goal was to read a novel per month. That did not happen. I actually only read 5 books, which was actually a bit surprising to me because I did have a few weeks where I read more than a book in a week. But those were, again, very kind of short-term reading projects. I was not reading consistently throughout the year, which resulted in me only reading 5 books throughout the entire course of the year. The next goal was to read webtoons consistently, and honestly I thought this was an easy goal because I really enjoy reading webtoons and I can easily get kind of swept up in a story and really engrossed in reading them. But honestly, I was not very consistent this year in reading webtoons. Again, once I have access to my language learning planner and can actually show you guys a graph of when exactly I read webtoons throughout the year, I will do that. But for now, I can just tell you that no, I was not very consistent. I did do it occasionally throughout the year, but not consistently throughout the year. And then finally, my last reading goal was to read outside my comfort zone, which again is a goal for me for 2025, because I would say that no, I didn't really achieve this either. Occasionally I would read outside my comfort zone, but very rarely. So hopefully next year I can be more successful in that area. Moving on to Korean writing, I had the goal of writing more in 2024, and I don't believe I did. Once again, I'd have to check my planner to see exactly how many hours I spent writing and how often that was. But my gut feeling is that I did not spend that much more, if any, more than the previous year on writing. So I'd have to say that I probably failed my goal. I definitely didn't do as much as I had hoped to throughout the course of the year. Next up is Korean speaking. My first goal for speaking was to become more eloquent when discussing complex ideas. And I would say, no, I don't think I did that this year. I did get involved in a community of swing dancing, like I mentioned already, but I didn't actually have that many deep conversations yet. I am hoping to kind of get more involved in communities that have more native Korean speakers, and so hopefully I will develop more close friendships with actual native Korean speakers, which will lead to having more deep conversations, longer conversations about deeper topics, and therefore will help me achieve this goal in the future. But as for last year, no, not really. I don't think I really became much more eloquent in speaking Korean. My next goal was to become more able to express my personality, and again, because of all the same reasons, I don't really think so. I think slightly, probably, I did, because I was speaking fairly consistently throughout the year. In the spring, I had a brief little language exchange with another professor at my university, and then in this fall, again, I had more opportunities to speak because of the swing dancing, but again, because I wasn't having kind of longer, more complex conversations, I don't think I really deepened this ability that much this year. So maybe slightly, but not a ton. And yeah, in setting these goals, I had mentioned I wanted to either take italki classes or just get more involved in my community. And so I definitely did the second half of that. I did get more involved, and hopefully now that those kind of roots have been set, I can develop that into having more chances to actually achieve these goals in the future. And then in the kind of Korean other category, I had the goal of watching more news on more varied topics. Again, I'd had to look at the actual breakdown of when I did news throughout the course of the year to see how consistent I was on this. I don't think it was very consistent. I definitely did it in November, where I was watching a lot of news because I had a news-focused November, and I was pretty successful at that, even though it wasn't as active as I had hoped. But outside of that 1 month, I know I occasionally watch some news, but again, I'd have to kind of check and see how often I actually did this. So I'd say yes, technically I did achieve this goal, but I am curious to see how often I actually did it throughout the course of the entire year. The next goal was to travel more in Korea. Yes, I definitely did. When my friend came to visit, like I mentioned, we traveled around to a few different places. I can think of like 4 or 5 off the top of my head, just in Korea, and then also Japan, of course, as well, which was huge for me. But outside of that 3-week span of time, I didn't really travel, which again, I don't think I really expected to. But I will say that now I am going into Seoul quite a bit more because of swing dancing than I was before. So I am definitely getting out of the house more often than I was in previous years. Then finally, I had the goal to expand my social circle, and definitely, yes, I did this year. I finally, like I said, got involved in swing dancing, and so because of that, I have a lot more friends, and I have a much stronger feeling of community in Korea than I did in the previous year. So definitely very successful on that, and very excited about that development as well. Moving on to Mandarin and Japanese, my first goal for these languages was to be consistent, which meant to study at least a few days in each month of the year, and definitely did not succeed in this goal this year. In 2023, I actually recall each month I would like think to myself like, oh, did I study Mandarin or Japanese this month? And I would actually like have this goal and be motivation for me to study more each month. But this year, again, I was just kind of lower inspiration and motivation in general and just lower energy. And so I did not have those thoughts like I did the previous year. And so I definitely did not achieve this year, especially for Japanese. I will put on the screen how many days I actually studied for Mandarin first, just to kind of show how consistent I was. And it wasn't too bad. I'd say I was mostly successful with Mandarin, I think, even though there were a few months where I did 0 Mandarin active study. Most months I did touch Mandarin for at least a couple of days. So kind of sort of successful on Mandarin. Japanese, much less successful. There was a lot more 0 months. In fact, almost half the months of the year I had 0. So definitely not very strong for Japanese. Yeah, I had 1 strong month, 2 mediocre months, and then the rest were pretty weak for sure. I also had the goal to do a language challenge or project, focus on each language, and I did manage to do this. I had kind of a Japanese content focused project like way back at the beginning of the year, and then also I had a Mandarin focused week near the end of the year, so I did manage to do a kind of project focused mostly on each of these languages at some point in the year. My final goal was to watch more Japanese content. I'd have to actually check the numbers to see if I actually did watch more overall content in Japanese compared to the previous year. My instinct, I don't even know, actually. I think perhaps I might have edged out the number of hours I spent watching content this year compared to the previous year, but I'd have to honestly check. So once again, check back at some point when I do have that video kind of breaking down individual activities for each language throughout the course of the year to see if I actually did watch more content or not. But if I did manage to edge out last year, it definitely was a lot more clustered in one time frame compared to the previous year, probably. So, and then in the kind of general language learning or other category, I had the goal to continue to track my language learning progress. Yes, obviously I did track my time and what I was doing this year as well. The second goal I had was to work on writing an academic journal article. No, I did not achieve this year once again, but I did, like I said, attend a few conferences as well as present at a conference. So definitely did make some progress in my professional life, even though it wasn't exactly writing / publishing an academic journal article. And then finally, I had the goal to continue to make videos consistently on this channel, and I had to say I only partially achieved this goal this past year. I definitely had a few months where I was not present online almost at all, which again is directly correlated to my motivation and inspiration for language learning. When I'm not feeling inspired to make videos, I'm also probably not feeling very inspired to study in general. And so Q3, Q4 were kind of rough consistency-wise for me on this channel. Hopefully next year I can be better about being consistent, both in my motivation for learning languages and in my inspiration for making videos here. And then finally, before I finish this video, I did kind of want to mention briefly my subjective feelings about how I did improve in each language this year, or whether I did improve in each language this year. Starting with Korean, do I feel like I improved in my Korean this year? Honestly, it kind of feels like I'm in the same place skills-wise as I was last year, which is crazy to say when you consider that I spent over 150 hours of active time on Korean this year, whether that's reading time or engaging in conversation at swing dancing, for example. So I'm sure I did make some semblance of progress in Korean. It's just hard once you get to the advanced level to actually feel progress. It's much more subtle, I guess. And so even though it feels like I didn't wildly improve this year, I'm sure I did make some small steps in my abilities this past year. I did have that huge milestone of reading that book all in one day. I actually had made a video earlier this year talking about why I feel like my Korean reading skills still kind of suck compared to where I feel like they should be at this point in my learning journey. And I had mentioned in that video how in English I will get really sucked into novels. I'll often read them all in one day, and I can't do that in Korean yet. And it was really validating to have later that same year the experience of getting sucked in and finishing a novel all in one sitting. So I realized that genre is very important, and genre has a lot to do with how sucked in I will get into a book, into a plot. And so moving forward, I can hopefully have more of those experiences and kind of feel a lot closer to my English reading experience when I am reading in Korean as well. So huge milestone there. Very excited and happy about that moment in time in my language learning journey. Moving on to Mandarin. Do I feel like I improved my Mandarin this year? I think I honestly kind of maintained and solidified the foundation I have in Mandarin this year. I actually feel like I did more this year in Mandarin than I actually did. Looking at the overall time spent in Mandarin, it was just 28-ish hours, I believe. And I feel like I actually did a lot more reading onto Chinese than I actually did this year. But I do think what I did do was pretty effective. I feel like intermediate stories are pretty easy for me at this point. And because I did do lots of binge watching this year, mostly in Korean, but also some in Mandarin as well, I definitely got a ton of input as well. So surely my listening comprehension was also improved slightly as well throughout the course of this year. So yeah, overall feeling pretty neutral positive about my improvements in Mandarin this year. And then finally, how do I feel like I did in Japanese this year? I feel pretty bad. I definitely ended the year feeling very negative about my improvements in Japanese. In fact, I feel like I went backwards in Japanese. I started out in Q1 doing a decent amount of Japanese in preparation for going to Japan. I don't think I really necessarily improved my Japanese a ton during that time, but I did kind of solidify what I had forgotten in the previous few months of not doing anything in Japanese. And then the last 6 months of the year, I did almost nothing. I did only 3 hours overall, shows and active stuff, and less than 1 hour active time in the last 6 months of the year. That's almost nothing. So I feel like I've forgotten everything or almost everything that I learned the previous year when I was doing literally daily consistent Japanese reading for like 5 months of the year. I'm sure if I actually was consistent again, I would recall things pretty easily. So I don't think the knowledge is totally gone, but it's definitely very, very rusty for sure. So not great with Japanese. I feel like I've not done super well this year. So yeah, that was my 2024. Hopefully you enjoyed this look back at the last year with me. Let me know down below what your successes were for the past year, what your low points were for the last year. Did you achieve your goals or not? And yeah, that is it for this video. I will see you guys in the next one. And until then, annyeong.